This is FLOSS Weekly. I'm Doc Searls. This week we'll be talking to Boaz Betzler of IBM about Linux on Z-series mainframes. That's coming up next. FLOSS Weekly is brought to you from LastPass Studios. Securing every access point in your company doesn't have to be a challenge. LastPass unifies access and authentication to make securing your employees simple and secure, even when they are working remotely. Check out lastpass.com/twit to learn more.
Podcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is TWiT.
This is FLOSS Weekly episode 602, recorded Wednesday, October 28th, 2020. Linux on IBM. This episode of FLOSS Weekly is brought to you by Linode. Simplify your cloud infrastructure with Linode's Linux virtual machines and develop, deploy, and scale your modern applications faster and easier. Get $100 in free credit when you create your account today at linode.com/twit or text TWiT to 474747 for a direct link to the offer. And by Melissa. Like expired milk, 30% of your customers' data goes bad every year. That's money down the drain. Visit Melissa's developer portal for free access to data quality APIs, demos, and code samples. Freshen up your sour data today with 1,000 records cleaned for free at melissa.com/twit. Hey everybody, welcome to FLOSS Weekly. I'm Doc Searls. I'm joined this week by my co-host Aaron Newcomb, and our guest is Boaz Betzler of IBM, who's going to talk to us about Linux on Z-series mainframes, the history of that, where it's going, where it's been, how it changed the world, and the rest of it. So welcome, Aaron. You there?
Yes, I am here. Good to be back on.
Look at that.
How's it going, Doc?
It's going well. A little less cluttered background than I'm used to seeing there.
You know what? It's funny. Last time I was on, I haven't used Skype since then. Last time I was on, I put up this background that I often use for Zoom, which is the Computer Chronicles set. I loved the Computer Chronicles when it was on, and I love going back and rewatching the old episodes because you learn a lot about computer history. And so anyway, I just threw it up there and never took it off. So that's my background for today.
Is that the one that was out of Channel 60 in San Mateo?
Yeah,
or wherever it was.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, I went to a couple of those. Yeah, there at a station in Hershey, Pennsylvania. So where are you these days?
Yeah, well, of course, I'm working from home, just like a lot of people. Yeah. And you can tell because I haven't taken a shower this morning. I've still got my shadow going on. But hey, that's the way it goes. I think
you're growing up
just
in the bottom then, and it looks like you could turn your head upside down. It'll look the same.
Yeah, exactly. Totally for me. I mean, I'm with you. I get more hair. If I just let this grow out, I'd have way more hair as a beard than I do on top of my head. I must just be gravity. That's what I'm going with.
I'm not quite at that point. The only thing, I mean, I grow this goatee, but the goatee is actually all it grows. But it's wearing off on top. Too much thinking going on up there, I suppose. So looking forward to talking to Boaz Betzler of IBM. But first, I have to tell you that FLOSS Weekly is brought to you by Linode. Managing your complex cloud infrastructure shouldn't be hard. Linode believes in cloud computing for all. They make deploying, managing, and scaling your cloud applications simple. Simplify your cloud infrastructure with Linode's Linux virtual machines and develop, deploy, and scale your modern applications faster and easier. Why do over 800,000 developers choose Linode? Well, they give you flat pricing across all 11 global data centers, intuitive cloud manager, full-featured API, and they have award-winning customer support 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, with no tiers, no handoffs, regardless of your plan size. Think of all the things you can do. You can host your website, build your app, store or backup media. It's up to you. Easily launch and enrich your developer applications, hosted services, websites, AI and machine learning workloads, gaming services, or CI/CD environments. You can launch and scale in the cloud with their virtual machines. Use your $100 credit on S3 compatible object storage, managed Kubernetes, and more, in addition to shared and dedicated compute instances. Be sure to check out Linode's new YouTube channel for video tutorials, security tips, and more at youtube.com/Linode. Bryce Adams from Metric says, from the start, we were looking for a partner, not a provider. Some of the large providers see us only as a transaction. Linode is the kind of partner that will be with us from the start, today, and beyond. So whether you're working on a personal project or managing enterprise infrastructure, you deserve simple, affordable, and accessible cloud computing solutions that allow you to take your project to the next level. Get started with Linode today. Visit linode.com/twit and click on the Create Account button, and you'll get $100 in free credit. To find out more, visit linode.com/twit. That's $100 in free credit when you create your account today. Linode.com/twit, or text TWIT to 474747 for a direct link to the offer. Okay, well, welcome back to FLOSS Weekly. Our guest this week is Boaz Betzler of IBM. You there, Boaz?
Yeah, hey, how are you all?
Yeah, I'm good. I'm only seeing myself so far, but I know you're there. This is a really interesting topic for me because I had started as a full-time editor with Linux Journal not long before IBM started putting instances of Linux on mainframes, and I remember what a turnaround it was for IBM back in those days when I think at one of the Linux World expos, they had WebSphere. That was the whole thing. Like, we're showing you WebSphere, we'll see how it goes. And the next time when they came back, they had bean bags for the geeks. They had Ethernet all over the floor. Wi-Fi wasn't that big yet. This is either in 98 or 99, somewhere in there, maybe even 2000. And it had like the biggest booth at the show. And it was a whole giant change. They weren't guys in like blue suits. They were all like regular geeks, all being with other geeks. It was quite a show. So tell us about how this came about for you. What's the inside angle on how IBM got into this?
This was an amazing time, right? Especially for me. I mean, exactly, around that 89 and 98, 99 kind of years. I actually had moved to New York at that point in time and was invited to go to one of those Linux worlds down at TWiT Center. And we wanted to demonstrate Linux on the mainframe, right? And actually had tried to get a hold of one of those rare machines. And it was right after a snowstorm, and we had to ship one of those mainframes down from northern New York down to TWiT Center. And I remember being even there on the truck and trying to do the final preparations to getting Linux running there. It was amazing. First time in New York for me, wearing penguin feet on the show floor there. Yeah, so I guess that was the show, right? I
remember this.
Of course, the hard time was before that.
Yeah. Did you have to get like special 220 volt lines or something like that in there in order to make it work? I remember
absolutely. I mean, being very ignorant, at that time about different kind of voltages and about, who can do what on the floor of the TWiT Center. You can't just run a cable there on your own, right? That's kind of something that was interesting learning on the way to demoing Linux on the mainframe for the first time to the world there.
How is it that I know one story about it that I only heard from one guy who told me. I thought this up over lunch one day, but I'm sure it was more thought out and strategic than that. But give us the backstory on how IBM got the idea to start really what ended up in some ways being a cloud business. I mean, I think if you look back that far, that may even be where it started. I don't know if you'd want to lay claim to that, but what was it that got into IBM's head with that?
Guess I have to disillusion you that there was nothing strategic, nothing planning. I can't remember whether it was really over lunch or over dinner or some beer or something. in any kind, we just wanted to unleash that mainframe. A couple of young folks that came from university, just had studied, were amazed at what was happening in the world of technology at that time. These were the early days of the internet. These were the early days of not only monochrome displays, but color displays, and even some interaction through a mouse or something like that. And we wanted to see this mainframe, this most powerful computer on the face of the earth. Could it unleash the capability also through some modern capability like Java? And then over lunch or over that dinner discussion, we figured out, well, before we get Java there, maybe it would be a good thing to get an operating system there. And one of the operating system that lent itself at that time was Linux, right? Which you could download and then put on floppy disks. I think over 20 of them.
So it was on a 360 mainframe originally, wasn't it? Before they'd rebranded it to Z or whatever. I think
the original architecture was the 360 architecture. At that time, in fact, we had the architecture moved to 370, and at that point there was a big branding of the 390 architecture, and that was the basis really of our first Linux port. We did leverage some of the big machines in the lab, and we had a hard time even getting a test machine, and I think we kind of stole different parts of the test floor to build our own system. The one that we demoed actually at that very historic Linux World down in New York was a multi-prize. This was like a half-size tower, and included some of the capabilities around the 390 processor architecture.
And also, we should, since we're talking about history, we should also have you explain what your connection with the project is. Like, what's your personal history with the project? When did it start? What are you doing now? That type of stuff.
So I started out in the IBM Development Lab doing test and level 2, level 3 support for an operating system on that 390 architecture called VSE. It was an operating system that's still around today, by the way, that's running quite some mission critical workloads still today. But even back then, it was cold. It was looked like submarine interaction, looked to me like something very archaic. Kind of the way they talked about elements of the operating system was not something that I was familiar with. And so really, together with a couple of friends there in the lab, we created this idea of, why don't we demonstrate our great capability to code something and port Linux to a new architecture, to that mainframe architecture. And of course, along the way, we got some help and support, and we were standing on projects that were there in the lab and in the 390 hardware development before, that provided elements of the compiler, elements of the assembler, elements of representing some of the 390 complex instruction set capabilities in a way that could be then used to build together the elements of a Linux kernel and then the Linux operating system. So I was down there leading the group of folks that did the coding. Most of them are much better coders than I am. I remember one day I was back then testing Token Ring and trying to fix the device drivers of the Token Ring network device. And I managed to bring the whole lab Token Ring down, a couple of 2,000 developers at that point in time. So yeah, hands-on coder plus kind of leading the way before I was extracted into Mothership in New York, being more under the control of the mainframe center there in Poughkeepsie, New York.
Yeah. And are you still with IBM today?
Yes, I'm still with IBM these days, working out of the home office. So still have the IBM logo here with me. These days, I'm working as distinguished engineers. I lead a global architecture guild. And these days, I'm working on cloud solutions for some of our largest customers in connection with financial industry, networking industry. Still get some time to work on actual coding. Just recently did quite a lot of hands-on demoing around OpenShift containers and so on. But very much focused on cloud these days and capabilities around public clouds, capabilities around hybrid cloud.
Yeah. I mean, this is quite a storied history. You and Doc were just talking about a few milestones, but I was just kind of curious if maybe you could tell us some of the milestones. We have a graphic here. This is from the IBM website, talking about the timeline in the history of running Linux on mainframe. But I was just curious, is there anything that stands out for you as you've worked on this as some of the big highlights of doing this?
Yeah, just taking a step back and looking at the overall timeline that you show here, all the applications, all the middleware, all the workload that's running there now. Remember, back in the days, we just wanted to demonstrate how cool we are and that we, had our act together, coding, hacking, creating something that actually runs, right? If you now think about it, that we're not only running, the kernel, and initially we were able to run a web server there over a serial line, but now that you have a lot of the libraries available, that you have most of the packages available today, also compile for Linux on the X390 architecture there, run on current versions of the mainframe. That's pretty amazing. At that time, also, I think it's important to understand that even from a capability, the mainframe was something very different than the ports that had happened before that at that time. Not a lot of ports were ported to the complex instruction set. Not a lot of ports were available for symmetric multiprocessor, which basically a lot of the mainframes were at that time. Not a lot of ports were trying to leverage the capabilities of multipath I/O that was available in that architecture back then. So there's some pride not only in being able to put that Linux on this platform, but also having a part on helping the community to get access to some of those advanced capabilities, which of course a couple of years later were common in many of the different processor architectures and system architectures for that matter.
Yeah. Well, I'm just kind of curious because I remember I was working at Procter & Gamble at the time as a system administrator, and we had a big HP presence. Sun was starting to creep in, and we had IBM as well, and we had mainframe. But I'm just kind of curious, the rumor of the death of the mainframe has been going on at least since that time, right? Was this an effort to try to revitalize the mainframe and make it more relevant for people as people were moving to Unix systems at that time and Linux as well?
I mean, to some extent, it was, of course, completely unplanned. But in fact, this is what happened, right? I mean, at that point in time, mainframes still used a very different networking architecture, used very different kind of programming, and couldn't run a lot of the application. Mm-hmm. After we actually had the Linux kernel running, it suddenly became clear that this is a great way to get a huge number of applications quickly running on the mainframe. Something like porting a TCP/IP stack to the proprietary mainframe operating systems at that time required a huge effort. And basically, we could just leverage a huge part of the stack anyway and just reuse the code and change some of the underlying device drivers. Same thing with web servers, with some of the application server technology that came out later on. Even think about the databases, right? And we could suddenly have a huge number of different databases, even from different vendors. In the early days, even Oracle database, and and then the growing number of open source middleware and databases could suddenly run on the mainframe. In hindsight, of course, that blew new life into the mainframe. And it's not that. It's very much kicking out there and running mission critical workloads, leveraging capabilities that are still unique. But definitely it was a big move, even in the minds of people, to say, look, we can run some of these modern applications. If I may add just another point on this, at that point, it was, the common assumption was that an operating system that very much relies on interrupt is very interrupt driven, like many of the Unix systems at that time differentiated themselves from more of the batch workload or other subsystems of mainframes or other large computers, mainframes. That was something that people didn't believe would fit very well with the S390 architecture, with the mainframe architecture that you have on the processor. Now, we proved that is not true, right? That something like a very interactive, even graphical user interfaces could well run on the mainframe, and that we could run at that time emerging e-business and web workload, World Wide Web workload at that point in time was something that we were able to prove and that we now have, right? Hundreds of customers running as their daily business.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that actually. In terms of, I mean, you mentioned that there were other Unixes out there, and there was, right? I mean, at the time we were running HPUX on our HP systems and AIX on our IBM systems, and Linux wasn't quite there yet for a big company like Procter & Gamble. I mean, at the time, Red Hat was just starting to make the shift, I think, into enterprise from kind of a I don't want to say hobbyist, but that's really what it was, a hobbyist distribution, if you will, to an actual enterprise grade operating system that you could run. And so for us, it wasn't mature enough. So, but AIX was there. I mean, you would think, and AIX ran all of those commercial applications like you mentioned before in terms of SAP and Oracle database and all that kind of stuff. So why not just pick up AIX, which IBM was already selling, and just run that? Why Linux?
Well, I mean, there's a lesson about open source and about the community to learn there as well, right? Naive as we were, I mean, we just picked the operating system where we had the easiest access to the source code to. There actually was a version of AIX that was ported to the 370 architecture and later even to some advanced architectures of the mainframe. And there was even a Unix kind of version or a Unix subsystem available in the MVS or OS390 or COS operating system as it's called today. So that technology was available to us, and internally we were asked that same question: why not just go with AIX, right? That's the real mission critical operating system, the operating system that runs actual business, not this thing that some guy up there in the Nordics is playing around with, right? That all didn't really matter for us at that time, naive as we were, right? We just needed an operating system that we had easy access to the source code, right? And easily could massage, change, use, collaborate with, interact with others with. And by the way, I don't want to let unnamed the fact that there was also outside of IBM quite some interest and activity on Linux, on the mainframe, and on leveraging open source on the mainframe at that time. So access to the source code, I think, was the differentiator. And true, it did take a couple of years until basically Linux was on par with its capabilities around reliability, scalability, serviceability, even feature functions on leveraging the latest capabilities of the architectures, compared to some of those commercial Unix operating systems that you mentioned. Interesting thing is, right now that there's no real big commercial market for Unix operating systems other than Linux out there anymore, right? whereas the mainframe is still there, kicking, quite successful in the market. So that's an interesting lesson to learn on innovation and on how open source can actually over time take on very much a function of something that is commercially developed and that is more purpose developed rather than something that's more coder and community motivated and developed like Linux.
So I have I want to run by you what my experience talking to IBM at one of the Linux shows in, I guess, around 2000. It was give or take a year from 2000, I think, where all of a sudden there was this huge contingency from IBM. There's a room full of people that want to talk about what they're doing. And they said that they had done this thing where they wanted to study how much Linux was already used inside IBM. So they surveyed one division. I don't know which division it was. It was an engineering division. And they found that they tested for 5 levels of awareness, and the bottom level of awareness was can spell Linux, and the top level of awareness was hacks kernel code. And everybody, like 600 people, they could all spell Linux, and 120 people were actually hacking kernel code. Also, they looked around the company and they found they had several million instances of Samba running on old iron, on old actually PC iron of one kind or another, being print and file servers. So the way I took it at the time was that IBM came into alignment with its own engineers at a time when other bigs at the time, including I suppose HP and some others, weren't doing that. And I'm wondering if you were one of those people that got surveyed or whatever, but what your side of that was, where you fit into that picture, as best I recall. I might be off.
Yeah, I'm sure at that time. At that time, I was trying to hide and not to show up on the radar, right? But no, definitely. I was actually surprised as well by when we started this project, how many other collaborators we would find within the company who had worked on glibc or compiler technology, different other tools that are needed, like New Assembler or something. How many folks within IBM were able to help us and also had their own hands-on experience hacking and contributing to some of those packages and some of those projects. Now, at that time, I think a major shift happened within IBM. Rather than drive innovation as something that comes top down and innovation as something that maybe just a few drive within the company, there was more and more the recognition that innovation is something that requires leveraging your whole set of talent, your whole set of skills, a very diverse set of input. At that time, of course, the whole idea that you collaborate on open source with the external world was something relatively new. However, the Academy of Technology at that time, IBM has an Academy of Technology, which is the technical conscience of the company, with some freedom to try out technologies that might be at the periphery of the strategy, at the same time also recognized by senior executives as a community that is going to define what the next stages of innovation mean for the industry and for the company. So that group, the IBM Academy of Technology, did help all those different individuals that in their spare time and free time at that time had done some open source programming or leveraged some of the projects or even contributed to them. I think the diversity of being able to select technologies, to select different kind of implementations is something that was burned into the DNA of the company. I think starting around that time, I mean, even today, there's quite a variety of tools, quite a variety of folks that can either choose to run Windows, Linux, or use an Apple system as their daily workstation. The different kinds of tools that are used throughout the company are very diverse. So in so far, I think that was a pattern that we started to see at that time that has continued and helped the company to drive new ideas and drive reinvention.
So I have a question I'm going to ask you, because I know you, it was your job to kind of sell what you were doing to Linus. But before we get to that, I have to let everybody know that this episode of FLOSS Weekly is brought to you by Melissa. Ever forgotten to check the date on a carton of milk? Well, like milk, your customer data goes bad. In fact, up to 30% of customer data goes bad each year. Melissa makes sure your data is accurate and current so you can reach the right customers. Their tools have helped businesses maintain fresh data for over 35 years. Identify your customers and get to know them. Add consumer demographic information to your records, such as property and mortgage data, even marital status or social media handles. Melissa will fill in the gaps by adding emails and phone numbers. Identifying current customers easily allows you to find new prospective customers through Melissa's prospect database. Verify your addresses, emails, phone numbers, and names in real time. Incorrect data entered by customers, simple human error, or duplicated records makes it easy for bad data to find its way into your system. Melissa can help you verify your data at the point of entry. Match and consolidate your records. Melissa's matching and deduplication tools help you uncover, merge, and purge hard-to-find duplicate records for an accurate 360-degree view of your customers. Melissa's flexible deployment options offer different platforms to suit any preference, business size, or budget. With flexible on-premise, web service, secure FTP processing, and software as a service, SaaS, delivery options, you can choose the best way to meet your unique business needs. Melissa continuously undergoes independent security audits to reinforce their commitment to your data security, privacy, and compliance requirements. They have the utmost dedication to your data's security by implementing strong controls and safeguards when processing your data. Over 10,000 businesses trust the address experts. Trust Melissa to be your foundation for data-driven success. Melissa is supporting communities and qualifying essential workers during COVID-19. See if your organization qualifies for 6 months of free service by applying online. Don't put up with sour customer contact data. Try Melissa's APIs in the developer portal. It's easy to log in, sign up, and start playing in the API sandbox 24/7. Get started today with 1,000 records cleaned for free at melissa.com/twit. That's melissa.com/twit. Okay, so I have this question about Linus himself, because it fell on you, Boas, to go and talk Linus into digging this thing. Is that right?
Yes, and I mean, in reality, is the question was, as a company that is used to interact with business partners and customers, and CEO talks to CEO or something. This was a completely new thing. How do you deal with the open source community? How do you deal with the Linux kernel mailing list, right? Unclear, right? How you would interact, and typically, especially at that time, and probably even long after that, before COVID, people had to meet face to face and kind of shake hands to get agreement. So there was the idea of how do we get an agreement from Linus Torvald that porting Linux to the mainframe and then releasing the code is a good thing. There were two aspects to it. One, how would the Linux community feel if a large company like IBM would suddenly appear on the plate and contribute code? That was not something very common at that point in time. And the second question was, is there anything that we need to do to make sure that our code has the right level of quality? We had started to learn that it's the quality assurance in open source is very different than what we've been used to do maybe prior to that. So in the end, we figured out there needs to be some kind of handshake. And of course, Linus at that time would not necessarily interact with IBM and say, oh, yes, I'm going to, shake hands with some executive. And so we figured out we could meet on some neutral ground in some hotel on the West Coast. And of course, at that time, we had already learned that demonstrating running Linux and showing the running Linux on a mainframe to someone really reaches hearts and is something that overcomes barriers. And so we had this big plan. Okay, we're going to meet Linus. We're going to show him a demo. At that time, it was not very common to have network-connected notebooks around with you or something, and access to a mainframe was something quite seldom there. So we had planned this whole thing for a long period of time, and I traveled to the West Coast for the first time with one of my mentors, with Karl-Heinz Strassemeyer, and we meet Linus there in this rented a suite or conference room large enough to have 30 people in there, and I think there were snacks or something, or some drinks and something, and Linus looked at that and was quite happy and was quite forthcoming. And one thing I did is I want to make sure that I get something out of that meeting. So I had prepared a couple of printouts with a certificate, and I asked Linus to sign it for all of the developers that had helped me put this project and effort together. And as I asked him shyly and sheepishly, could you please sign these certificates that I already printed out? He said, well, it would have been nice if you had spelled my name correctly.
Oh my gosh. What did you get wrong?
In any case, the day after we went to the beach and took a swim. It was late in the year, so it was very cold. Never know why Karl-Heinz had this idea of going for a swim. And I remember that there on the beach, we actually on a piece of paper with a pen drafted the email we're going to send to the IBM executives internally with the statement that we are all good and we talked to folks in the open source community and to Linus himself. And we are ready now to release the code and make this code available to the world.
Wow, what a story! I'm curious, was there also a commitment to maintaining Linux kernel at that point? Was there some sort of it sounds like there was a blessing from Linus at that point, but was there also some commitment from IBM's standpoint to help grow the Linux community?
So, just from a mainframe perspective, right? This was first of all, a contribution, a tree that was quite exotic, right? And it took a while for it, right, to have the right shape and form to be formally accepted in the kernel. At that time, a very good friend of mine and a colleague, Martin Schwiedewski, became the Linux kernel maintainer for that 390 or X390 code at that time. But I think taking a step back, of course, mainframe and contributing to mainframe is quite a small set of folks that would do that and contribute to that. But overall, at that stage, IBM realized that there is the need to embrace the open source community and to provide the give back. So not only for the port of Linux to the mainframe, but also for some major elements of memory management, of the kernel scheduler, of many other Linux projects, of many other open source projects outside of that. A real avalanche started of IBM having hackers contribute to different projects, but also over time then creating projects in the community, growing them, contributing large amounts of code. And finally then this very North Star commitment of the CEO to say we're going to invest $1 billion for the good of Linux going forward as a business. And of course, a large part of that was also contributing intellectual property to the open source, but also contributing code and maintaining and keeping capabilities current and doing bug fixing, but also adding new function over time.
Go ahead, Doc. Do you have a question?
Yeah. So sorry, we passed notes to each other, just so you know, Boaz. I was. Oh, geez, where was I going to go with it? I actually. Oh, yeah, I know what it was. Do you know Dan Fry, who at IBM, who was at IBM for many years? Yeah. So yes. Dan, I had a conversation once with Dan about. About all the kernel hackers that were working at IBM on the Linux kernel. That's all they were doing. They were not working on IBM stuff. I'm thinking in particular of Ted Show, I think was working on the file system or something. And Dan said it actually, even though IBM meant well from the start, it took like 6 years or so before it became clear that it was better for IBM to turn these guys loose, that they couldn't tell these guys what to do, but these guys could tell IBM what to do. Like, here's what's in the pipeline. And that there's an adjustment required for companies that are hiring kernel hackers, alpha hackers, that lead maintainers. That's good for the company. You just know that having these people working for you is going to be good for the company, rather than we're going to try and steer the Linux kernel in one direction or another, because that's not going to work. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, you know, there's an interesting discussion around the philosophy of innovation. Do you drive innovation top down and set the direction for innovation, and then have engineers implement and work along that strategy? Or to what extent do you leave it up to the community to identify over time, to improve projects, to shape projects, to identify which areas to expand, which areas to stop doing, which areas to start doing, right? That is an interesting discussion, which path is more successful. Because as a company, if you just hire an engineer, even alpha, right, hacker, and say, okay, implement the following. And then you start to measure six months afterward. Okay, did we ever sell this piece of function? Did a customer pay us money because we included this piece of function? And are we making a profit out of it, right? And typically that mechanism is not very good and successful in making sure that the right parts are developed. However, if you give an open source community time and let them hone it, let them discuss it, let them take their time, that investment is well worth it, because you see that things can come out of it that are much bigger than originally intended. I mean, who would have thought in the beginning of the Linux kernel that it would not only run on some desktops or on some test computers, it would run on servers, it would run on mainframes, it would also run on watches, it would also run on a lot of mobile devices. I mean, if you had given a group of alpha developers the task, build an operating system that is one size fits all to cover that all, it would have never worked out, right? The project would have failed many times, because every 6 months when you test whether you're starting to make a profit out of that strategic imperative, you find out that it's not happening, right? So yes, you need to cut them loose. You need to trust that something will come out of it. And of course, like with so many innovation, out of 10 times, 9 times you fail and 1 time you succeed. But the open source community and open source development is an excellent substrate to drive such innovation. And I think that's what we learned. And that was something that IBM had understood, which eventually also led to the interest and the willingness and the desire to have someone like Red Hat be part of the company. That understanding the value of the engineers and the contributors, and what that does for the innovation capability of a company. That is something that, as Dan said, we learned, right, the hard way in those days, right? I mean, in the beginning, we tried to direct them and tell them what to do, and had long discussions on what to do, and then we found out that's not very effective. For example, for the longest time in our port to the mainframe, we used an internal assembler tool to create the assembler code, the instruction code for the processor. And we had long discussion whether it was the right thing to do or whether we should use the GNU assembler for it. And we discussed this for several weeks on whiteboards or blackboards at that time. I can't remember. And we had discussions back and forth. And then at one point in time, one of the engineers, Martin, he came back on Monday after a very long discussion on Friday and said, you know what? I spent all Saturday and Sunday just getting GNU assembler to work. Here it is. Let's just use it. And that was the end of that discussion.
That's awesome. That's an awesome story. I love hearing the open connection that you were sharing earlier, but I also want to ask about some of the modern developments that are still going on running Linux on the mainframe. And it occurred to me, in my day job, I work for a company called Sysdig, who we have actually a really good partnership with IBM in terms of cloud monitoring. You might be aware of it. But we mainly deal with monitoring and securing Kubernetes environments, essentially, which is quite a new technology. But now, as I'm looking at this in hindsight, what I'm thinking is that really, if you think about the way that containers run on modern systems, I mean, the way that Linux was being run on the mainframe, there's a lot of parallels there in my mind in terms of, the way that Linux got broken down. And I don't want to make it too technical, but do you see that parallel as well in terms of running Linux on the mainframe and the way that people today run containers on, standard Linux open systems? Is that a fair comparison?
So let me tell a story. One of the things that happened is that a business partner took the Linux kernel that we had put together, and mainframe has a long history of providing hypervisors. At that point, the hypervisor VM, or these days CVM, was the hypervisor that some of the people used. And he put Linux in that hypervisor called VM, and he fired up 20,000 instances of Linux with that hypervisor on a mainframe. So that was in 99 or 2000, around that time. And here's I. Here my friends. We are from university. We represent the anti-establishment. We represent innovation. And the very first reaction we had: why would anyone ever do something stupid like that? Run 20,000 instances of a Linux operating system anywhere, right? I mean, forget that they ran it on a single server, right? Now, I have to correct myself, right? I mean, basically, that foresight at that point in time was something we should have picked up a lot earlier, that running so many instances and then separating applications into smaller pieces, identifying services in those applications, identifying services in a small construct as microservices, and then separating them off into virtual machines running, part of the Linux operating system. That was something that was very far-sighted, right? If you think about 20 years later, now we are running, it's common to run 20,000 instances of containers, right, in a construct somewhere. And it's very common, and it helps for scalability, it helps for separation, it helps for resiliency. I mean, all the reasons that we have today for running containers, right, kind of were something where the groundwork was laid back at that time already. So back to your question, there's a lot of the basics that I think were discovered at that time already, and I think what we start to see is that with containers, with Kubernetes, with OpenShift, we see a lot of work in the community that can immediately be leveraged on the mainframe as well. And we're running the same containers, and now we even have containers for multiple architectures, right? That we can run both on x86 or on mainframe architecture, on other architectures, and have the same packaging, have a lot more uniformity on how those services are packaged in containers and how they are then deployed and how they are even managed. So it makes it a lot easier for us to move in a hybrid world between something that's running over there and then something that's running in a mainframe. We have uniformity of developer experience, we have uniformity of deployment experience, and we have uniformity of management experience, which is something that ultimately, I think was in many of our minds back at that point already, trying to get Linux to run on a large number of platforms, but also on different scales.
Yeah, it seems like you were just ahead of the curve in some ways, and you had a solution, but people weren't quite ready to run their architectures in that way as they do now, with thousands of containers in a cluster and hundreds of containers on a node, for example. I do want to ask you, and we don't have much time, so I guess this will have to be a brief answer. But with the acquisition of Red Hat now, or the merger, I don't know how you guys talk about it internally. But with that partnership, and now that the companies are together, what's the future of mainframe and Linux? What can you do now, I guess, that you couldn't do before? What can we expect to see out of running Linux on the mainframe with the partnership?
To some extent, it's homecoming, right? For us that we've been working with open source and with Linux, this working together now in one company with Red Hat is like homecoming, right? Finally, we're there where we want to get to. Now, one thing that we benefit from on the mainframe side very much is also from the many other projects that Red Hat is invested in and is driving forward, be that around Kubernetes, be that around different forms of storage attachments for OpenShift, be that around some of the automation tooling, even some of the very cool elements that we start to see on how to manage Kubernetes and manage a huge number of containers. All of that, we have a much easier way of quickly interacting with those engineers, ensuring that we both have it readily available on the mainframe, but also leverage some of the mainframe capabilities in those open source projects. For example, if we discuss key management, there are some very unique capabilities that are built in the hardware of the mainframe with respect to security protection around key management, and leveraging that in some of the other either operating systems or capabilities on the cloud. That is something that we benefit very much from with this combination of IBM and Red Hat.
Well, this has been I was just thinking, the really rich set of veins here. There's so much that we can talk about. We always wrap up with 4 quick questions that you probably will deal with several of them briefly. But the first is there anything we haven't asked you that you would like us to have asked?
A ton. I think I would love to talk about what the innovation capability of open source means for the future, and for combining not only capabilities of systems, but also driving that into the application space. That is probably something that I'd love to discuss at some point.
Yeah, that's man. We have to have you back. I mean, we say that often, but this is one of those things where I think it's a really rich thing. The second one is, do you have anything to say about blockchain? That's our control question we ask every week.
Yes. So we just had an education event for my Global Architecture Guild, and we tried to implement an application there, and had them just implemented with different technologies. One of the teams surprised me by implementing it using a blockchain, and they were the winner of the day for me because they leveraged a technology that for this application I hadn't thought about at that point in time.
So the last two, what are your favorite text editor and scripting language?
VI. And I have this hate relationship with YAML. It's not text editing, but YAML. I have a real hate-love relationship with YAML. Yeah.
and for scripting, are you a Python guy or any other one? Or probably Python. Probably good old shell scripts is still something that as a person that still has to work with Windows systems and driving some of the applications around Windows systems, I do a fair amount of shells there on Windows. Well, with VI, you're definitely in compliance with Linus because he's a VI guy, passionately so. Well, this has been great, Boaz, and forgive me for mispronouncing both Boaz and Betzler earlier. I know somebody named Boaz and somebody named Belzer, so it threw me off. So forgive me for that, and we'll have to have you back on the show. It's been really great.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, great. So Aaron, that was a too short an hour, I thought.
Exactly my thoughts as well. I was just going to say we could probably go on for another hour, just reminiscing about all of the technology and the developments that have gone on for running Linux on the mainframe. And it did bring back a lot of memories for us. I remember those sales conversations we had with our IBM sales team, and we were considering getting rid of our mainframe, and they were like, no, you can reuse it. You can run Linux on it now. And I think they even brought up the point about running whatever it was, 20,000 instances of Linux. And I remember at the time thinking, well, what would we do with that? How would we use that? And today, the answer is simple, right? I mean, you deploy all your services and, all that stuff. And you take things up and down at will. So today it would make perfect sense. But back then we were just like, I don't know what we would do with that running Linux on the mainframe. So it's just fun to reminisce about this stuff, and great to see that it's still going on. I think that, the acquisition of Red Hat, the more I think about it, the more it makes total and complete sense for running things like OpenShift on the mainframe if people want to. And, it makes me want to go find one of these mainframes at one of these surplus equipment sales that go on. But I don't know how I would fit that in the back of my minivan.
That's going to suck a lot off the grid, some of the older ones, but still. There's a lot to be said about it. I just remember what almost like a species change that IBM went through. I mean, if ever there was a staid, consistent company about which nothing changed, it is kind of like, no, we're taking a Washington Monument and we're going to make it out of something else. It's just like, whoa. But they were way ahead of everybody on this. It was really great. So what would you like to plug for us this week?
Sure. Yeah, usually I talk about my book, Linux for Makers. I guess I'll talk about it just quickly. Go out, search for Linux for Makers if you need a Christmas present or a holiday gift for someone who's new to Linux but is interested in running the Raspberry Pi. But also, I just wanted to mention my new YouTube channel, which has been growing fast. It's called Retro Hack Shack. You can find it youtube.com/c/Retro Hack Shack. And, that's where I have channeled all of my work and love for restoring old hardware, fixing up old systems. Think of IBM PC 5150, and I found an old Technica monitor which was thrown in the trash and literally covered with dirt, and I restored that and brought it back to life. And I'm currently working on restoring another monitor, a 5154, which was the EGA version monitor for the IBM PC. So working on that right now, and that'll be coming up hopefully by this weekend if my parts get in.
Any 3270 terminals? Those are so common back then.
Those are awesome. I haven't found any, at least reasonably priced. You can find them on eBay, of course, for, people are really trying to milk it on eBay. But I typically find my stuff at, local places or people that want to send things to people that are restoring them to keep them alive and working. So it's a lot of fun. Check it out. If you do, hit the subscribe button on that channel just to get more of my videos when they come out. I'd really appreciate it.
That's great. Well, thanks a lot. This has been terrific, and I will have to have Boas back on the show. And that's a rich fate. A lot of the old stuff that needs to be restored. I just think of the stuff that I want to get data out of. I don't care if I restore the old machines, but there's a Linux journal machine called Happy. That's an old Debian box that everything I wrote was on that, and it got pushed to the magazine when I was living in the Bay Area, and it got pushed up to Seattle, where Linux Journal was, and there's some cron job that would do it every day. And that's when I had 16 dedicated IP addresses with like a little bit better than a dial-up line. But that's sitting in the garage, and it's got a lot of stuff I wrote on it. It's just sitting there, but I don't know, eventually. Anyhow. Well, this has been great. So thank you, everybody. This has been Floss Weekly. I am Doc Searls, and we'll see you next week with a really good show.
Hey, what's going on, everybody? I am Ant Pruitt, host at TWiT TV. Got a question for you. Have you gotten tired of how bad your photos are looking every time you post them to Instagram? Better yet, have you gotten yourself a new camera and you can't quite figure out why the images just don't look that good? Well, I have a solution for you. It's my show, Hands On Photography. Each and every Thursday, I sit down and share different tips and tricks that are going to help make you a better photographer and a better post processor. So subscribe today at twit.tv/hop to learn more.